other things. I think the only thing we've not seen there, again, related to credit management, is a lot of the companies are trying to upsell these products to residential customers versus the businesses based on some like credit sales repayment data. But I haven't yet seen a lot of that proven, especially in the markets that we've been piloting in. But there is opportunity to focus on collecting that information to be able to get good quality customers. And then just moving on, because I know we have just 3 minutes, other models that we've seen for consumer financing is your typical microfinance, people like Finca that are designing products for micro enterprise, and then standalone asset finance companies. For example, there's one in Uganda called Enagro that's trying to provide small holder farmers with consumer financing for productive use. And I think the more interesting one, which not only works for standalone, but also works for some other models, is community models, where we're seeing cost sharing on the initial capital costs. The issue there is that you have to think about social cultural norms, land tenure laws, and all these other things that happen in agriculture, and the other technical aspects. And I think there's an opportunity for governments to pay attention to things like building out grower business networks to facilitate acquisition and monitoring of this equipment so that maybe they can lease to farmers. So that could cut on the cost and enable them to be able to use these appliances. Flipping over to the supply side, which is
just
the biggest
quickly within a minute,
exactly.
a minute, please.
Flipping over to the supply side, which is, I guess, a bigger challenge, because we've just talked about consumer financing. The bigger need to operate a credit model means that businesses need a lot of financing. I think that the answer here is they need more concessional capital. They need grants, they need equity to be able to support R&D, to be able to do consumer research, because that's exactly where we are in the market right now. They need more patient equity, and then they also need some more interesting instruments like results-based financing, guarantees with the banks, and so on, which have a lot of other dynamics I won't get into just because of time, in terms of, as you're working with local finance, what does that mean in terms of giving guarantees that directly finance capital for distributors, and also encourage uptake, because we have seen challenges on the home system side. So what does it mean on this side as well to make it a lot more effective and interesting for the banks and the businesses as well?
Yeah, thank you very much, Crystal. Quickly, I'm going to hand it over to you, Rebecca. From the work you've done so far, especially under the Powering Agriculture Initiative, what do you see is required by the government to, catalyze and create an enabling environment for productive use of solar in the agriculture value chain?
Sure. Well, we've been focusing on Uganda as a case study, as I mentioned earlier. So let me tell you what we found there. Uganda is obviously an example of a predominantly agrarian African society where most of the farming is small scale, low input, non-irrigated. But because of the collapse of the cooperative as an organizing structure for farmers during the sector's liberalization in the mid-1990s, that's left Ugandan farmers with very little price negotiating power and with few linkages to the food and beverage multinationals like the groceries and the breweries that actually serve the growing demand from urban customers. So that's meant that post-harvest agro-processing actually accounts for very few jobs right now in Uganda, as little as 2.8% of employment. That said, a wave of technologies are now coming up from the bottom up, as everyone on the panel has mentioned, but the challenge here is around a farmer's ability to pay. And in fact, if you look at data from the IFC, they find that across the entire continent, the addressable market for irrigation, cooling, and refrigeration, as well as agro-processing, is about 11 billion. But when you discount for farmers' ability to pay, that serviceable market shrinks to about 700 million, so a drastic reduction. And of that, most of that serviceable market is in irrigation. So it says that there's really a lot of opportunity for government to support the agro-processing space. What our research has found is that there are three things that governments can do right now. One is, obviously, as I mentioned, reforming the cooperative structure to aggregate farming produce, to leverage economies of scale, and to organize farmers around price setting and processing for value addition. Second is what our spatial analysis shows is that there's a strong overlap between where decentralized energy is expected to be the least cost energy solution and where croplands currently don't have access. So that would suggest that rapid and targeted deployment of decentralized technologies in village communities could enable support for both staple and cash crop farming. And then third, of course, is incentives, as Crystal was just mentioning, to increase access to micro and commercial finance for farmers, cooperatives, and businesses, and the rollout of technology-specific enterprise training to enable easy access for rural end users.
All right. Thanks so much, Rebecca. Okay. Hello? Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to move straight to you, Natalie, just within 2 minutes. And I think what I'm going to do is once I give the thumbs up, that means you have just about 30 seconds left to round up. So, Natalie, I think I'll just go over to you straight. And based on what you said about sustainable design and the principles, I think you had mentioned it a bit, but what practical steps can solar companies and funding partners take, in integrating resilient design for standalone solar technologies, when it comes to the agricultural value chain? So, yeah. I think you're on mute. So you can hear. I think you're on mute.
Thanks. Again, if I were a solar company, I would really partner or hire, recruit people who understand permaculture-based design and agroecology, because when you design with nature, right, the way that nature grows forests and food is the most resilient model. And when we understand that and apply that design thinking to farm systems, then we can harvest wild energies, but we mitigate the negative impacts of wild energies. So understanding the solar orientation, the wind direction, and how to design and engineer the landscape and structure it so that we're absolutely harvesting every bit of water runoff and nutrient runoff. And that is a supplement then to the solar systems. So, working with the permaculture community, and, many people may not know what that is. I did post a link to one of my Facebook groups. Please just Google or YouTube permaculture, for permanent agriculture, how to establish stable systems that harvest all this energy. So what again, if I were in the solar sector, I would really partner up with people who are doing conservation agriculture, permaculture, and just making sure that farmers understand that before you bring in solar equipment and pumping and all that stuff, there's a whole host of things that needs to happen to make your farm resilient, to make the soil like a sponge. So any bit of water that comes is held. So to the solar world, work with designers, everyone who's working in the regenerative movement. Regenerative is about, how we work with nature to put, somebody mentioned crop debris, biogas slurry, all these things. We cannot just suck nutrients and resources out of the soil on the farm. We have to give back. So once we design a system to do that, then the solar can come in and supplement that.
Great. Thank you very much, Natalie.
I just want to add, a lot of it is about, honoring indigenous and traditional practices, because many things that were happening long time ago were really about conservation agriculture. Now people are doing tilling, monocropping, mechanized farming, soil is just washing away. So that's how you get a very vulnerable farm, because you're not putting things back in. It's degenerative, not regenerative. Thanks.
Great, thanks a lot, Natalie. Michael, over to you, because you're on this panel. You represent the private sector. You're actually going out to these communities, last mile communities, deploying the standalone solar solutions on the ground, and hearing from the different panelists, especially the last input from Natalie, speaking about integrating this design principles. Can you speak specifically to the challenges that you faced when deploying these solutions, and how you've been able to address them, specifically around financing, quality, consumer behavior, and sustainable design principles? Just quickly, within 2 minutes, please.
It's a broad area that you're listing, so I'm going to maybe focus in on a few. First, I just wanted to speak to the financing piece, because that certainly is one of the biggest challenges faced by our clients. They just don't have much in terms of access to financing sources. The traditional finance sector and the microfinance sector are really not designed for asset financing. They don't have the skill sets to evaluate it. So we've seen that to be a real challenge. We've also experimented in terms of, so we provide pay-as-you-go financing, and we're big believers in that. We were inspired very much. CGAP and IFAD published a great piece in 2005 called Managing Risks and Designing Products for agricultural microfinance. And they really spoke a lot about what's worked and not worked, both for ag finance and for microfinance, working with farmers. And we've, some of the key principles are don't tie the repayment to the harvest, because that creates a mindset in your clients that can have adverse effects in their repayment. We do absolutely believe that you have to take into consideration the actual context of your farmer, but you have to manage willingness to pay and credit versus ability to pay. We see that in many cases, the ones who can pay are the ones that, if you're not following up, are the ones who will be the latest. And we also see that there's a diversification of income sources among many farmers. And when they make these kinds of decisions, they're considering that. So we certainly have, we've taken through experience and also experimenting with some seasonal payment plans. We've seen that simplicity is the name of the game, that, these are very complex things to roll out. If you want to scale something, you're having to deal in different regions. You're having to deal with very long distances, and the operational consistency of your teams is really important. So we found that simplifying with clients made sense. The seasonal plans didn't really work out. They actually confused the client. If you work with an off-taker that can ensure payment at the harvest, that's great. Then a seasonal payment plan would be perfect. But if you're actually the one who has to flex on that, it's much easier for them to plan to a monthly plan, and you just have to adjust it so that they can work with the finance despite the seasonality of harvest. So that's just our experience, and there's many different contexts out there. I mentioned financing as a challenge for our clients. We have to do it. We've tried to approach banks. We've tried to work with microfinance organizations. They're just not operationally or skill sets set up to do that. 90% of our clients buy on a pay-as-you-go basis. And we survey, and they were surveyed the 60 decibels, third-party sort of lead data surveyor. Only 3% of those finance clients said they had an alternative, a viable alternative. So really gets to that being one of the key challenges. I won't speak too much to the product quality part. You asked a bit about that. I'd say there's some great organizations now. The industry's evolved a lot. We learned a bit the hard way, but now CLASP, their global lead program, is doing a lot of great work here in identifying good manufacturers. Shell sponsored China Impact Sourcing. They're a great organization for that. So I just would point you to them, and happy to share our insights offline. And then last, if I have a few minutes, I can talk consumer behavior, or should I stop?
I think I'll come to that in just a second question as well. Just also give some time for Manas. If you can just following up on the role that FAO does, you can speak a bit more around how do we ensure coordinated planning between the standalone solar sector and the agricultural sector in order to maximize these opportunities that exist in improving the agro value chain. By integrating standalone solar technologies, how do we ensure the coordination? So quickly within 2 minutes, thank you.
Yeah, so as soon as we talk about the use of energy for agriculture sector or the agriculture value chain, by definition, this is a multi-stakeholder approach. There has to be a multi-stakeholder approach, because what we're talking about are two sectors that need to work together. And regardless of which energy technology we talk about, could be energy, solar technologies or bioenergy technologies, these approach is technology agnostic. So the approach of multi-stakeholder engagement and dialogue to come to a point where we could understand which technologies might work, which incentives might we require from the Agriculture Ministry, for example, what incentives might we require from the Energy Ministry, and then also include the private sector. So generally what FAO does is we are currently supporting the Ministry of in the government of Zambia and Rwanda. We've done this in Turkey and Egypt in the past. As soon as we start working, we form a working group, and that working group always includes the Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Agriculture, but also the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. Discuss the problem, understand what the issues are, develop a technical baseline. We start with the agriculture side. So if you're looking at which technologies might work, and in terms of solar technologies, we have to be very careful because different value chains need different solutions. So we first try to understand the needs from the agriculture side. So recently, we did some work in Rwanda where we mapped out the 4 biggest value chains. So it was, for example, the dairy value chain, the cereal value chain, and the tea value chain, and one more. So what we look at, try to understand from the Ministry of Agriculture and the agriculture sector point of view, what are the energy needs? So in dairy value chains, for example, the biggest need is always cooling. But in a cereal value chain, the biggest need might be of milling. So trying to understand the need, what the energy demand is like, going back, understanding how can we supply that, talking to the ministries of agriculture, the environment, and the energy ministries to understand how that can be linked to the existing program, the existing policies, and making them work together. And very often this happens through a multi-stakeholder dialogue. Otherwise, we do a lot of technical consultations with the experts in the field, inviting them in one room, representatives from across the ministries. And that is how generally the coordination works at country level.
Great. Thank you so much. Now, and I'll come back to that quickly. But just asking just a few more specific questions before I take questions that are on Slido. Quickly, Rebecca, just can you speak a bit more to, now that there's a lot of focus by government on local manufacturing and job creation, can you speak a bit to local manufacturing and job creation within the productive use space, especially also bidding on some of the work you've done around powering jobs? So, quickly within 2 minutes.
Yeah, sure. So Powering Jobs, what Chibikam is talking about is a study that we did in 2019. It's the most comprehensive job study for the energy access space that was done to date, but still only scratches the surface of job estimation and creates basically a baseline for future data collection exercises. It captured employment data from over 100 companies in Nigeria and Kenya, and basically allowed us to understand across the entire decentralized energy spectrum what job creation looks like. The early data showed that although a very nascent sector, the decentralized renewable energy space is actually creating as many jobs as traditional utility scale power sectors. In Kenya, as many as 10,000 persons are being employed, which is on par with KPLC, and in Nigeria, about 4,000 persons employed direct formally, roughly the same as the electricity and gas sector in Nigeria. But to Chibikam's point, what the survey also found was that orders more, i.e. magnitudes more jobs might be possible through applications of energy access and productivity. Just to give a sense of scale, the literature estimates that right now productive use jobs might be around 65,000 in Kenya and 15,000 in Nigeria at the time of this study. But one of the challenges is that energy companies don't standardly track end user job creation as a performance metric. So we really do need more research in this area. That said, as I mentioned before, post-harvest agro-processing is already counting for very few jobs in the continent, which means that there's really an opportunity here for growing that sector. And as you can hear from everyone on the call, from the private sector side, there really is need for persons getting into this space. So I think in terms of recommendations, as the agri sector continues to develop, farmers and agro-processors are going to need a greater range of technical and business and behavioral skills that the current training systems just don't produce right now. So I think that governments can really help to mobilize resource for widespread training and recruitment programs, and that's a really important point, through agricultural, technical and vocational institutes, as well as cooperatives, to ensure that the workforce is able to leverage all of this access to energy and finance that we're talking about today.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. And Crystal, over to you. Just still on the issue around local manufacturing, secularizing local manufacturing. Can you speak a bit more about ensuring quality standards, for productive use when in context of local manufacturing as well?
Yeah, really interesting thoughts there. I think the first thing that I should call out at the beginning is we still feel like the market is quite nascent to set particular standards on what products can look like, given the diversity in configuration. And also what that looks like. I think someone already called out different value chains work different ways for some of these appliances. And so that it would be very difficult to create standards at this point as the market is still growing and innovating around that space. However, it's important to develop a framework or metrics to consider for quality appliances or quality technology in this case. I think there's an opportunity for governments to create some form of standardization, either certification for suppliers or manufacturers. I think Michael already called out there's some initiatives from funders and development partners, people like Shell Foundation dealing with China Impact Ventures or Global Leap with CLASP, looking at how they can certify suppliers versus products at this point. I think there's also an interesting learning from other markets. I think there's something like Mexico presents a really good case for market protection strategy, where they implemented a certification scheme for solar powered irrigation suppliers and installers versus on the technology itself. So I think it's still a nascent market and something to pay attention to. I think it's worth it to develop a framework and thoughts around what good quality products look like, but not necessarily regulating it at this point with standards. And I think more emphasis on the consumer confidence and awareness, just like Rebecca mentioned earlier, for them to be able to also understand what efficiency looks like, what good quality looks like, as well as they're dealing with different suppliers.
Great. Thanks so much. Back to you, Michael. Being hands and heels on the ground, beyond solar water pumps for irrigation, which I know is where you're focused on, how about other opportunities that exist across the value chain, so say for processing, within the processing space specifically? I know you had mentioned earlier that you're looking into that, but can you speak a bit more to the opportunities there as well?
Yeah, we definitely are looking into other, processing as well as cold chain. I say the challenge when you in any productive use segment is that the use cases are more specialized. There's a greater diversity of the needs and the specifications your clients need. So unlike, say, a home system product, it's not a one size fits all. You don't have the same homogeneity in the marketplace. So why that's challenging is that for every client, you really need to evaluate their needs, and they may have very different volumes they're working with. There may be differences in sort of the grains they're working with. There could be all sorts of varieties, even in local preferences and sort of how things are processed. So you don't get the same set of market size that you would maybe in a product that is really standardized. So it increases the cost of the business and also increases the complexity of delivering it. You need to then have your staff able to evaluate the client's needs are and come up with a solution for them. And you can't really afford to have an army of engineers out there doing this. Your prices to the client just would make it unaffordable. So for pumps, as one example, what we've done is we've developed a way of automating that design process where our staff can ask a handful of questions, and then automatically that will design a solution for them. And then we've operationalized that to be able to then sort of deliver that to them, because there's many different pumps that might be needed, different number of panels, pipe, wire, all sorts of different variations. And as we think about some of the other applications, that same kind of thinking needs to go into play, and you have to start off with sort of, as a framework, you got to make sure it's going to be profitable to the buyer during the repayment period. So they have to start benefiting from it right away and buy more than they're paying. If they're not better off from day one or from the first sort of cycle of use, then they won't benefit from it. They won't stick with it. You got to make sure there's enough of a market size. Even adjusting for some customization, it's got to be sizable enough. And then you have to work out the supply chains. There has to be someone manufacturing the stuff somewhere. So there's a number of different steps. And we found in the past when we've done some evaluations that the set of options shrinks with each stage of your evaluation. But there definitely are some options. What I would do is I'd say, we do some research on our own with partners. And the ones I'd point to, I'd say, is sort of the leading thought thinkers or thought leaders in the space. A2EI is a great organization. They've got a great research group out of Arusha. That's the Access to Energy Institute, and they've done a great paper on different productive use applications and sort of the economics. Selco Foundation, India, but also doing a lot of work in East Africa, has done a really broad look at different productive use applications. So that would be my sort of counsel. And then I mentioned this earlier, the importance of working with value chains. You have to start with the value chain. You have to know who all is playing in it before you start getting involved in it. You cannot operate in a silo in this sector.
Great. Thanks, Michael. So I think one of the key things I take away from what you said is there's opportunity, but I think mainly on the pilot phase at the moment. I think I'm going to go straight to you, Manas, beyond what has been discussed so far, and based on the role that FAO plays. Beyond what has been discussed so far, what other support or what other role can standalone solar provide across the agricultural value chain beyond just what has been mentioned? If I can speak to those as well.
I think a lot of the things have already been said. One of the things that I would point to and bring this to the table is also, so when we talk about technologies, and very often it happens is that certain technologies get to a point where everybody wants it without doing proper assessments and understanding the context. So as one of the speakers said, it's not something like one size fits all, and the importance of really understanding the context, analyzing the context, the real needs, and then matchmaking the needs to the technology and the solutions they can provide is very important. And when you talk about what has been, how it can help smallholders, we're really talking about resilience, right? And solar technologies can be instrumental in two kind of resiliences, if I may. One of them is actually resilience towards poverty, because you see smallholders are poor and are sadly remain poor because of structural problems as well, because they don't have access to services, they don't have access to things. And one of those things is access to energy, because access to energy can really enable a farmer to produce more, sometimes process those raw materials into higher value products, thereby earning more. So access to energy can increase resilience to poverty as well, but also to climate change. So any kind of energy can do that. But right now, in the context that we talk about of the growing greenhouse gases, if Africa develops completely reliant on fossil fuels, or and starts to consume a lot of fossil fuels, then there is a long-term problem as well in terms of sustainability. So this is also an advantage or an opportunity that Africa has to use renewable energy technologies to derive the kind of energy services that they can provide to increase resilience towards climate change, while at the same time increasing productivity, reducing losses, and increasing employment. So I think decentralized solar energy systems have a real advantage, because they by the fact that they're decentralized, so you don't need to invest a lot in developing power lines. For example, we are working in Rwanda, and the estimates there, because it's hilly, to extend 1 kilometer of power lines is around $12,000 up to $15,000, which is very high. So if the entire country has to be connected by grid, then the cost of expanding that grid is super high, and that will never be economically viable because the people who are consuming it don't have the power to pay for it for a long time. So decentralized energy systems like solar, and there are other technologies as well, in terms from biogas to consumption, to combustion, to gasification. But yeah, so they can increase resilience among farmers by increasing productivity, reducing losses, increasing employment, but also just generally pulling them out of poverty as well.
Thank you so much, Manas. I think just building on that, Natalie, just to round up the set, before I go straight into the questions asked by the panelists, quickly, just within 2 minutes, please, can you just speak on your experience so working with refugees and the vulnerable groups, the kind of models you've been able to work with these groups in adopting sustainable and resilient practices? How do we extend this kind of models to incorporate or integrate standalone solar?
Well, that is a market question, but I want to say that there is no other option for climate action other than agroecology. And I just want to be really clear that conventional agriculture and chemical farming is one of the biggest contributors to climate change on our planet. The largest environmental problem we have in the world is soil erosion. So, again, designing a resilient farm system with earthworks and stoneworks and soil building is first a key thing that has to happen. But then, yeah, I mean, obviously all the other issues, the financial inclusion that needs to happen, and the market access, the market facilitation. So NGOs like mine can use, whether that's, a market, an M4P approach, making markets work for the poor. So because sometimes it's about matchmaking with stakeholders in the market, right? So if I go into a rural area and find that certain products are not available and that the market is maybe not serving the demands, then what is my role as an NGO to try to unlock those economic contestants and make those linkages. But again, I just would really caution people from ushering poor smallholder farmers into, investing in things that when the first thing they need to be investing in is their soil, their agrobiodiversity, and making the farm as resilient as possible. If you go to Kakamega Forest, it's a very intact and stable system, and there's no solar power, no products like that. So I think, in terms of the approach of permaculture and agroecology, the only input that's required is knowledge, how to do resource recovery. And I think somebody mentioned earlier about crop debris. We also have to be thinking about circular bioeconomy economy, about donut economics. Google Kate Rayworth. How are we doing resource recovery so that before we start investing in hardware and infrastructure, how can we make that landscape totally intact and stabilized, and then again start to come in with select products, including solar, solar products as well, and just really focusing on the soil organic carbon and all of those elements of building naturally the soil biology, the soil chemistry, so that again any drop of water that is brought through a solar system to that farm is going to stay as long as possible. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Natalie. I think just so much insight, and I know I've kind of been rushing for you for everyone to share so much information within a short time space. But just to take a couple of questions, and I'll just point specifically to questions that have not really been addressed within the discussion so far. I think this would be for you, Michael. Is there any specific type of crop or size in terms of the land that farmers use that would make to gain more if they use solar water pumps? I think it's the context if there has to be like a minimum farm size before solar water pumps can be more productive for farmers.
I wouldn't counsel a single crop. I think soil, location, solarization, what practices, the local value chain that you're linked up with. There are many, many different factors that can lead to what's optimal. And it goes beyond farming. I mean, aquaculture, animal husbandry, there's lots of other uses of water where we've seen clients acquire the technology. So we tend to see that horticulture farmers need water more consistently than maybe others. The crops they're farming are maybe less resilient without water sources at key times in the growth cycle. So many of our clients are focused on some aspect of horticulture. Yeah, I mean, that's really and also the harvest cycles are a little bit shorter for many horticultural crops. So for them being able to see immediate return on their investment, it makes sense from that standpoint. Most of our clients are very diversified in their cropping. So it's not, I'm going to irrigate this one crop So yeah, I would not counsel a single crop, but say in general, we see a lot of traction with horticulture, but there are many other use cases that I think that merit this kind of investment.
Great, thank you. And specifically to you, Manas, as a question: does FAO make value judgments to support more sustainable and lower impact food chains? For example, dairy could divert energy and resource from more sustainable chains. So.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so in terms of dairy, we have actually an entire program called the Bioenergy and Food Security approach that looks at, so what you can do in a value chain, if you look at the dairy value chain, right, you can increase the access to energy by using, for example, decentralized solar systems. You can have solar cooling stations, so solar chillers that can increase the efficiency of operations and also decrease losses, and thereby making the chain more sustainable and green. But what you can also do is take waste from the animals. So, for example, in livestock sector, cows produce a lot of manure. What you can do there is take that manure, produce biogas, and now you have these systems that can cool milk through these biogas systems. You can make electricity from the biogas, but there are also cooler biogas chillers now that can directly produce cooling from biogas. So the idea about sustainability and making any value chain more green is twofold. One is to reduce the inefficiencies in it, so decrease the losses in that value chain, but also to use forms of energy or form of practices that can reduce emissions generally or manage natural resources more efficiently. So one of the good things about biogas in that sense is you can use the waste produced by the animal, produce cooling, use that cooling to chill milk, and the digest state that is produced by the biogas system can then go back